Good evening, Professor. Today we will be interviewing Professor Paul Gottfried. Professor Paul Gottfried is a well-known conservative historian of ideas in the United States. He was a professor of humanities emeritus at Elizabethtown College, where he taught for 25 years. He is also a Guggenheim recipient and holds a PhD from Yale. He is the author of 13 books, most recently his famous Fascism, Career of a Concepts, as well as Revisions and Dissents. And in 2014, our publishing house Wektory translated into Polish your book, War and Democracy, Professor, which is basically an anthology of some of your essays written over the years, ranging from various topics from conservative philosophy to history to American politics. So, Professor, I'd like to begin because in Poland, in our right-wing or dissident right-wing circles, you are known as the intellectual godfather of what has become known as paleoconservatism in the United States. What is paleoconservatism? How did it come to be that, apart from being conservative, something in the United States had to become paleoconservative?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that question because I am now editor-in-chief of Chronicles magazine. At the age of 77 and a half, this honor has been conferred on me. And I have to write an essay on this subject. I wrote one essay on what is paleoconservatism, which came out in the September issue. And now I'm writing another one as my first editorial comment. I always point out that paleoconservatism tries to preserve the heritage of what in the United States was the old right. The old right was I might say, a movement that never really had to be made explicit because it was based on shared assumptions about human nature, shared assumptions about the political good, and it was very critical of the advance of the idea of equality, and in the American context insisted that we were not a liberal democracy, but a constitutional republic. The use of the word liberal democracy has become very widespread as the political spectrum has been pushed toward the left, and our present conservative movement, to which we do not in any sense belong, emphasizes America as a liberal democracy that must spread democratic values throughout the world, and we obviously reject this. I think there is a very definite, one might say, Christian anthropology present in the old right and in paleoconservative, one might say, as its fighting wing, or as the people who took on the rest of the conservative movement. There's an assumption that human nature is fixed, that man's nature is essentially flawed, and that any attempt to use the state or to use government to improve human nature is not only going to be ineffective, but is going to make the political and the cultural situation much worse. So we end up rejecting most of what the American government has done in the name of equality, overcoming prejudice and hate, probably since the middle of the 20th century and even earlier. I think the late Murray Rothbard took an even more extreme position and spoke about rescinding the 20th century, something which you Poles would not like, since your independence was restored after the First World War.
Yes,
And then,
to some extent
back
at least,
from
yes.
Soviets more recently.
Indeed.
Going back to the 19th century would, subject you to rule by the Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire, and the Prussians, something you obviously would not desire. But I think Murray was sort of carried away by his opposition to the modern state. But in any case, the paleoconservatives become the fighting force, one might say the shock troop of the old right, and is called upon to battle the neoconservatives in the 1980s when they take over the conservative movement. Anti-communism, which had been the cement holding the conservative movement together for a very long time, becomes obsolete with the fall of the Soviet Union, though neoconservatives who hate Putin keep on referring to him as a communist and try to present the struggle against what is obviously a right-wing nationalist Russian government as a continuation of the crusade against communism. I don't think that washes very well, except for some of the viewers of Fox News who believe just about anything they're told there. But the paleoconservatives shared with the neoconservatives a strong revulsion for the communists, although they tended to be right-wing anti-communists, not left-wing anti-communists. They were not concerned about the communist, how they treated gays or women or something like that. They simply saw them as a revolutionary force trying to undermine Western civilization. Right. But that kind of anti-communism, I think, became obsolete by the end of the Cold War. Paleoconservatives are hanging on. I'd be very happy to have people under the age of 80 who are paleoconservatives these days. I always tell people that however old I may seem, I may be one of the younger paleoconservatives around.
That's for sure.
It is very important to find a younger generation to carry on our traditions.
Right. That definition is important because in Eastern Europe, in Poland especially, the image of a typical American conservative to a Pole, let's say, fairly familiar with the American political scene and the American political system, is that, a typical American conservative is probably anti-Russian, anti-communist, for low taxes, usually pro-life, and reads the Bible in some form or another. And here you present a more a deeper definition of what real true conservatism is. That's what we can call paleoconservatism, which might come as a shock to some Polish observers of American life, because they believe that anybody who's not a conservative, as defined, for example, by National Review or by Sean Hannity, is by definition a fascist or an isolationist. So I'm pretty sure you've come across charges such as these, and how would we respond to such ignorance?
Well, it's very hard to respond to it effectively because the enemy controls the media. And by the enemy, I mean the regular left, which is anti-white, anti-Christian, anti-male. I mean, these are the people who control the media, not only in the United States, but in Western Europe and Canada, probably in most of what was the Western world outside of Eastern Europe, maybe parts of the Mediterranean world. But these people are very hard to respond to because they have an agenda perpetual revolution. The conservative movement is hard to respond to because they have basically marginalized everything to the right of where they stand right now. If you go back and you read old copies of National Review, they are far to the right of where the paleoconservatives are. But the conservative movement has been in a steady movement toward the left, probably since the 1980s. Therefore, paleoconservatives who are positioned to the right of wherever the conservative movement stands right now on things like gay issues, social engineering by the government, feminism. We reject not only third wave feminism, we reject the first two waves as well. But if you take those positions, you obviously are a racist, a Nazi, an anti-Semite, and so forth. And the conservative movement is just, is delighted to be rid of its own right wing. Because it's always in the process of moving to the left on most social issues, where it does not move, where in fact it is quite grounded, is in a global democratic foreign policy, right. Building up the military, helping the arms industry, and supporting the Israeli far right. Right. These are the issues where it never moves. And not surprisingly, a lot of its funding comes from the people who have an interest in those positions. If that funding were not coming from people like Murdoch and Sheldon Adelman and others, the conservative movement, the official or established conservative movement, would be a lot weaker than it is.
Right. So we're in 2019 as we speak, it's the ending of October, and the godfather of paleoconservatism. How does the godfather of paleoconservatism assess the 3 years of the presidency of Donald Trump, which to some, in a way, signaled a return to many paleoconservative themes, which were raised especially by Pat Buchanan in the 90s and his America First campaigns in 1992 and in 1996. You're a very good friend of Pat's. You know him very well and his message and his strategy. What is your take on President Trump, his policy, his staffing, in general?
I have, you know, this may come as a shock, but I've been extremely critical of Trump. I do not care for the man's personality. I find most of what he says appalling. You know, I would have been very happy to have Pat Buchanan as president. I'm not very happy to have Trump. Nonetheless, I find myself in a position having to defend him against neoconservatives and against the entire left. He's attacked very often for what are his few strengths relative to the other side. That he has some sense of, you know, of the limits of American global outreach. I'm not sure he did the right thing in Syria, but his impulse was correct. And you know, he says that we're not going to lose more American lives fighting over the Middle East.
Right.
In his own sort of inept, sometimes incoherent way, I think he rejects the policy of global democracy and the assumptions of liberal internationalism, which, you know, all paleoconservatives are violently against. Domestically, I really don't see paleoconservatives of any kind getting any influence in the administration. The people who have worked for him are neoconservatives who've been willing to support him. They've sort of gone over to his side, right, like John Bolton. Or else just regular Republicans who are willing to work with him, people like Lindsey Graham. I don't think he's even aware of paleoconservatives. There was an article that appeared on Town Hall a few days ago by a young man named Malarkey, and it's sort of a Gaelic Irish term, malarkey, meaning nonsense. Mm-hmm. And I thought his piece was nonsense about how paleoconservatives are running the administration.
Oh,
and
if only.
I'm writing a response. I said, how many of them can you name who are even allowed onto Fox News? Since Buchanan was removed, not a single one is there. Right. How many write for National Review? 0. How many write for the Wall Street Journal? 0. How many are allowed to be even on the masthead of conservative magazines? Buchanan and I are allowed to be on the masthead of the American Conservative, which is not a particularly right-wing magazine, but we're allowed to be there for the sake of diversity, ideological diversity. But, you know, that we have no presence. We're not allowed to write for most conservative publications, and we are certainly not represented in the administration. I have no, and, you know, when I hear Trump speak, occasionally you catch, one might say, phrases that might be used by.
Right. Right. It might be a lot of, as some people on the alt-right might state, virtue signaling. I mean, themes such as endless wars and talking about trade deficits and the immigration question, that obviously comes from the messaging that Pat Buchanan talked about in the 90s. And we know that Buchanan and Trump had their history, especially in 1999 when Trump labeled Buchanan a Nazi, but we also know that a few years later he called him and he apologized for that, which is interesting considering that Donald Trump doesn't apologize to anybody. So out of all people, he apologized to Pat Buchanan. Well, I guess that's something positive. What I want to ask you, Professor, in the context of the upcoming elections, because we know the Democrats are sworn enemies of Trump, and this impeachment hearing is definitely going to go forward. There will be articles of impeachment. Who do you see on the left, on the Democratic left today, as being the best and potential, the best standard bearer of what comes to be known as progressive leftism in the States today, and the best person, the best Democrat who can actually beat Trump in 2020 if he doesn't get impeached before the elections? Who would that be?
Well, by the way, he is going to get. He might get impeached, and they just let him off. And I'm even would question whether the impeachment would, I mean, there would be impeachment proceedings, but I don't think the impeachment would even pass the House of Representatives, since there are a lot of Democrats running in highly vulnerable districts who are not going to vote to impeach him. But whatever the case, I think he's highly vulnerable. And he's being attacked 24 hours, a day. I turn on a local channel in central Pennsylvania, and he's being attacked there because the local channels are NBC, ABC, CBS affiliates.
So much diversity, Professor. So much diversity.
Yes, that is diversity. And Fox News may have twice the number of people watching it as CNN or some other MSNBC. But the problem is that most of the reporting of Trump on Fox News is negative. You do get Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham and a few others defending him, but if you listen to their news programs, they're almost uniformly anti-Trump.
Right.
Then, of course, the other stations are 24/7 anti-Trump. You have to add to this educational institutions, many churches, the social media, right? It's very hard to see how this guy is going to prevail, particularly since he doesn't sound particularly coherent in his given to outburst, which really don't help his cause very much. The Democrat who I think would clean his clock is Joe Biden. Despite all the horrendous scandal associated with Biden, despite the fact that he is a liar and probably senile, he should be able to beat Trump easily, even with all the attacks on Trump or the revelations about his corrupt behavior and his son's corrupt behavior in Ukraine and China. His popularity is soaring, whereas Trump's popularity is going down. Although the accusations against Trump are empty, the fact that they're being played up so effectively by the media 24/7, and the fact that, Biden is seen as just some poor guy being attacked by the extreme right, have had the effect of helping Biden's presidential bid. I think he could easily beat Trump, and I think the left would use him as a transitional figure. He really has no convictions that I can determine, and he has about the IQ of a sea scallop. But those things aren't going to hurt him. They're going to put him in, and they're going to present him as everybody's grandfather and a sweet man who's conciliatory. Although by now he's taken over just about every crazy social position of the left. But they'll be able to use him for 4 years if he survives. They might even keep him there for 8 years. But his administration will be occupied by the crazy multicultural left. You'll get people like Beto and the gay lobby and the people who want to take away your guns. They'll all come to power with him. He'll sort of be like Hindenburg, 1 minute before Hitler took over. Right. He's a man without any convictions, without any mind, but he will be used by the left. And the media has worked very hard to show he's a highly intelligent, moral, sensitive leader who would make a very good president. And Trump's popularity is it seems to be not high enough to get him reelected, unless I'm mistaken. Even Rasmussen, which is the most favorable, has him at 45%, 55% hate his guts. So I have no idea. By the way, in terms of what he has done in improving the economy and so forth, he's a wonderful president. The others are obviously going to wreck the economy, but it makes no difference because the media will blame anything bad that happens on Trump, right? Just the way it has explained the economic recovery by attributing it to Obama. And people will believe this, 55% or 80%. You know how the way democracies work.
Right.
People are, I'm reading something, a book in French on the iron laws of oligarchy. And that is the way things are run. You have, elites that control people. That's the way democracies work. And particularly when there are no communities and when religious leaders and others have lost their traditional influence. So, what I call the managerial therapeutic administration is able to control people in the name of overcoming hate and advancing democratic values. And I think this is what we see in every Western country influenced by the United States.
Right. Professor, let's switch topics now. Let's go more ideological and philosophical. There's been a debate ranging in Poland on the dissident right, our version of the paleoconservative right, for the last few months between two thinkers, Professor Adam Wielomski and one Mr. Krzysztof Karoń. The debate pertains to the true nature of Marxism and the proper definition of what has become known as cultural Marxism. Now, you have written much on the subject and spoken on the subject very openly and coherently, in my opinion. And I think your voice should be heard in this debate when we translate this interview. So first of all, can you tell us about the beginnings of cultural Marxism and what were its original aims when the founders, so-called, came to be?
Yeah, I think one has to take into account that my views about cultural Marxism are not common on the right. They're not even common among paleoconservatives. And one would think by now I'd be accused of being soft on Marxism.
Right.
Although for some reason that charge is never made against me.
That's interesting.
So far on the right, I have to be anti-Marxist.
That's interesting because the same sort of accusations are leveled against Professor Wielomski, who, in my opinion, takes the right view, sort of not the extreme view of Marxism. And I think the right view is how Marx defined Marxism himself, without adding any so-called mutations to it and labeling things that aren't Marxist.
Well, as you know, my view is that whatever the sins of Marxism, and there are many, what we are looking at in what's called cultural Marxism has very little authentic Marxism still attached to it. Right. Now, this does not mean any of the following. It does not mean that people who are cultural Marxists do not revere real Marxists, or that the anti-fascists in America do not adore Stalin, which they do, and Castro was another hero. There is really, or that people who are cultural Marxists do not deplore McCarthyism in the United States. I mean, they engage in all of the customary gestures of the Marxist left, and of course they celebrate the victims of McCarthyism and the Red Scare, and they love all the Communist Party members and so forth. However, the reasons that they are on the left is not that they believe in Marx's theory of history or in the need for Marx's view of socioeconomic transformation. It is that they hate the bourgeoisie for cultural, moral reasons. They are anti-Christian. They opposed traditional morality, which they see as oppressive. They hate all the things that traditional societies believe in, the hierarchies, the gender distinctions, and whatever. And they treat all of these things as hateful and either expressing or leading to fascism. Fascism is the term. And of course, they're against fascism, not because it represents the last stage of an otherwise decrepit capitalism, which would be the Marxist view, but because it is full of Christian white bourgeois bigots. This is why, and people have to be destroyed in order to create a just, happy society. Now, I think the first generation of cultural Marxists, going back to the Frankfurt School in the 1920s, are really trying to bring two things together, which really don't fit that well. They're trying to argue that they are traditional Marxists, and many of these people, I had Herbert Marcuse as a professor, and Marcuse would defend everything Marx said. He says, right, there's nothing that I will not, and he would defend this. And he was a Marxist-Leninist. He also believed in this polymorphic sexuality, which was sort of a kind of weird, bizarre variation on Freudianism, or a certain kind of Freudianism, sort of following the model of someone like Wilhelm Reich. But the two really didn't fit together very well. However, the first generation does cling to a Marxist identity. You find this in Adorno, you find this in Horkheimer, and of course they came to America in 1933, where they planted their ideas, and then the Americans, once they defeat German fascism and decide to re-educate the Germans, they send all these people back and put them in powers, to drive the Germans even crazier, if that was possible. But the fact is that we're not looking at something like traditional Marxism. Now, this also doesn't mean that cultural Marxists, who are not really Marxists, cannot become socialist again, which they are. I mean, they've now combined collectivization, nationalization, using the name of a Green New Deal or fighting racial inequality or something like that. They combine this with what's now we call intersectional politics. Intersectional politics is the essence of cultural Marxism. And I've even found self-respecting Marxists who say that all of this is bourgeois decadence. It is not real Marxism. Now, this is in fact my view. But what cannot be overlooked, this is another reason why I think there is some connection. There is a sociological connection. Many people who would have been Marxist in an earlier generation, because they hate white Christian bourgeois civilization for whatever reasons, right? Because they feel they're victims of anti-Semitism or victims of racism or something like that. These people would be attracted to both Marxism and cultural Marxism, because both are anti-Christian and anti-bourgeois, right? I mean, so that one might say it is the psychology of these people, or their emotional situation, that would cause them to be attracted to both. And this might explain why people who have lifelong careers as Marxists in America or on the traditional left, graduate and become cultural Marxist. Right. There's also another reason they move from one to the other, as in the case of Germany or France. You have people who, are traditional Marxists. You have former communists in East Germany who very easily become cultural Marxist, and they join the Die Grünen, the Green Party, or the party of the left in Germany is made up mostly of communist functionaries. And they all push open borders, gay rights, transgendered rights, and so forth. Now, this is because it is the only leftist show in town. You're not gonna run as traditional communists any longer. And these people obviously, feel deeply alienated from what we would regard as normal society. And they favor a kind of therapeutic dictatorship. And this is the only opportunity for the left that is still present in the post-communist world. So they move in this direction. The French Socialist Party is the same. Right. Which will defend the communist legacy. Lionel Jospin from the Parti Socialiste did defend Stalin and this, but he basically is into gay rights, open borders, giving more rights to Muslims. So people will graduate, as I see, from one form of insanity to the other. But they're not the same. They're. I think that they both represent leftist movements, but of a very different type.
Right. Would it be fair to say that a typical real cultural Marxist hailing from the Frankfurt School would be considered by, if he were alive today, by Karl Marx as a heretic in a way?
Okay. They were. In the Soviet Union, they condemned the Frankfurt School. I mean, the Frankfurt School may have fawned on them and crawled all the way to Moscow, but the Soviets were too self-respecting to accept any of these ideas like polymorphic sexuality. I mean, they didn't want this in Russia. I mean, the communists were relatively conservative on some social issues. That is why Poland and Hungary are much less radicalized than France or West Germany, or East Germany is more conservative than West Germany, because it was really less influenced by cultural Marxism, of which the United States was, a kind of major vehicle. American books, American ideas, even American policy, in occupied Germany, I think already reflected cultural Marxist ideas. But the Soviets wanted no part of this. And they simply recognized this as some kind of.
So, Professor, going to another topic now, more ethnic in a way. You're very well aware of the pressure that has been exerted on Poland in the last 2 years by certain Jewish American circles, also helped by certain circles in Israel, when it comes to questions of restitution of properties that were apparently owned by people who are still alive today, but we know that's not the case. We're talking about especially Bill 447, which was debated in Congress and passed a few months back. You wrote several articles, one in particular in the 90s. I remember the title was Polonophobia, in which you argued against this incessant, very aggressive stance by some international, especially American and New York-based Jewish circles as against Poland. You're Jewish yourself. I think your voice will be an important contribution to what we're seeing right now in Poland, especially after our parliamentary elections, which were won by law and justice. Professor, why the hatred? Why the aggression? Why do so many highly placed American Jews have this fear or literally hatred of Poland and Polish Catholicism?
It's an extremely important question that you're asking. And I always begin by saying that although I grew up in Jewish circles, they were not Eastern European, they were Central European Jews. And they generally did not like Slavs. They preferred, they even had a soft spot for Germans who spoke German. But I was surprised to discover the intensity of hatred that was felt by Polish Jews for Polish Catholics. My late wife was Polish, and one of her parents was Jewish, and the other one was Catholic. And I imagine these people were social outcasts among Jews because of the deep hatred of the Poles. I think it goes all the way back in history. And I was actually shocked to discover the way Poles have been turned into, perpetrators of Nazi crimes. I mean, you had almost 3 million Poles killed by the Nazis. I mean, next to the Jews, they probably suffered the most. And then you have this one lady named Debbie Schissel. It's like Schissel in German, but it's the Yiddish form of it, who writes that, the Poles were much worse than the Nazis. I have no idea where this person is even coming from, but nonetheless, this does seem to be a widespread hatred. I think it is totally unjustified. And it really should. It's probably not going to change because about 95% of the Jews in America are from Eastern Europe, mostly from the Pale of Settlement or from Poland. I don't think they were. I think they were treated worse by Ukrainians and Russians, but they seem to dislike Poles more. I don't quite know why.
Right.
But it seems to be very deeply rooted. The problem, it seems to me, is that while Jewish or the Eastern European Jewish hatreds are not the only hatreds out there, when you get one group of people that have disproportionate influence in the media, venting this hatred against some group it's like Serbs all day attacking Croatians or something like that, or Poles attacking Ukrainians. Okay, historically. I mean, you got to hear this 24 hours. I mean, obviously, or the Irish attacking the English. There may be some historical justification. There are stories about after the Second World War, there was the massacre of some Jews in Polish towns. I've heard about this, which in fact may have been incited by the Soviet occupiers at the time. But to run around and spend your life attacking the Poles and insisting that you have special rights to restitution and so forth, this to me is, one might say, an ethnic grievance which should not be allowed to go as far as it has. I think if the Polish government, I think even Trump has taken a position against the Poles on this. But I think if like the Hungarian government, if they stick to their guns, they're taking the most insensible position, because there's no way you can satisfy your accusers. It's sort of like the conservative movement running to accommodate black racists, screaming feminists. There's no way you're going to accommodate these people. So the best thing is to point out, yes, there were Jews who certainly suffered, and there were Polish Catholics who were killed, and we're going to try to be fair to everybody in this matter. But but Eastern European Jews do not have prior claims, which other victims of these totalitarian regimes do not. Everyone's to be treated the same. That is the only position that you're going to prevail with, because this is simply the beginning of a shakedown. If you give in here, next week they'll decide they want restitution for something else. And by the way, I give the same advice to the Germans who are being told by the Poles, give us this and want this. The answer is no on all sides. This is something, the example I always give is when the restoration took place in France after the French Revolution. I said, well, the changes occurred. Some of you lost property in the revolution, or Napoleon. It's going to stay this way. I mean, at a certain point, things are just going to stay this way. We can't go around changing everything. I think Charles X, who was an ultra monarchist, wanted to restore everything, and he lost his throne, which he deserved to lose. I mean, at a certain point, you can't, say we're going to give everything back, and certainly you cannot say that Polish Jews have some kind of prior claim which other victims of the Nazis and communists do not have. Everyone will be treated as victims equally.
Right. Which is sort of a paradox, because according to the narrative of our government, with this sort of neoconservative light foreign policy that is being pursued right now by the Trump administration, at least in terms of Israel for sure, and in terms of Eastern Europe, when keeping NATO open to business and bringing American troops to Poland. The narrative is we have the most pro-Polish government in Washington right now because they're protecting us against Putin. But on the other hand, we have a government or a president that has signed bills which basically are not in the Polish interest, and which were very much in the interest of the, at least, Jewish lobby in the United States. And how would you try to reconcile those two positions? Can they be reconciled? Can you have an anti-Polish and a pro-Polish American government at the same time?
No, I think the Latvians or one of the Baltic nations would complain they don't stress their guilt enough during and the answer is, we do enough. We dislike the Nazis. The communists killed more of us, but we dislike both sides being occupied. But that's the end of it. I mean, what more are they going to do to push back? Obviously, the United States wants to use Poland as a base of which to oppose the Russians. They're going to try to use you anyhow, whether you make this concession or not to to Eastern European Jews who have it in for the Poles right now. My position is you just hold tough on this issue. We're not going to do this. And you point out that millions of Poles were killed by Nazi Germany, were occupied. Warsaw, other cities were destroyed. And Polish Catholics suffered grievously in the war, and there were people who suffered under the communists grievously. Why do these people, particularly when you can't even authenticate some of these claims? Right. And I think all these things should be, part of the counter argument with which you push back.
Right. So go full Orban, as one would say.
Orban is my hero.
Amen to that, Professor. One other topic that I'd like to touch upon, one of your favorite topics. You have a lot of friends in those circles, the so-called neoconservatives. Here we're talking about another heresy, especially, but not a heresy in terms of Marxism, but a heresy in terms of conservatism per se in the United States. Some have claimed that neoconservatives sorry for that, we just had a little cat incident. Some have claimed that the neoconservatives in the United States under Trump have been weakened, divided. Some went to work for the administration. Some continue to criticize Trump on Twitter, like Bill Kristol, and so on and so on. But from your vantage point, are we really seeing, or have we seen, ever since Bush left office, a real retreat on the part of the neoconservatives, and maybe more importantly, neoconservative talking points that float around?
My position is we see absolutely no retreat on the part of, you just see, they sort of move from one victory to the next. One of the things that I've been asked by the American conservative to write on, but I may be too busy to do this, is the launching of a sort of left neoconservative publication called Dispatch. They brought with them David French, Jonah Goldberg, others from National Review who are sort of defecting to the left. I think Steve Hayes from the Weekly Standard will be in charge of this. Bill Kristol will probably join. Now, I see these people having an honored place on Fox News last night. This publication existed for maybe 12 hours, and these are anti-Trump, left-wing neocon dissenters who want a global democratic foreign policy, support gay rights, transgendered rights, etc. They have an honored place. Paleoconservatives are treated like Nazi scum by the same network. There are neoconservatives surrounding Trump. Most so-called conservative magazines are in the hands of neoconservatives, but even the neoconservatives who voted for Hillary, did not vote for anyone, are still in positions of power. The only reason Bill Kristol and Max Boot are not is they turned their backs on the conservatives. They said, we despise you. And they went over to CNN, or right. MSNBC. That is the only way that, the neoconservatives are going to leave, if they decide to leave. Otherwise, they run everything. The dominant view on foreign policy as represented by Heritage Foundation, AI, the Wall Street Journal, in National Review is neoconservative. I don't see any change. It's like, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union creating its own artificial opposition. The communists in East Germany were always playing that game that they created artificial negativity or artificial opposition. That's what I see in the conservative movement. There is no significant opposition. And if it does exist, it will be taken over by the neoconservatives within a few minutes. I won't even, it's very easily done. They are, they're major conduits of money, of funding. They still, control the heights of the conservative movement. They allow certain opposition to exist, but most of it is paper thin. Even the populist right in the United States is controlled by neoconservatives. You go on, they had a gathering called on conservative nationalism, to which, of course, I was not invited, but Professor Legutko was present. Right. Entirely run by all these neoconservatives. There's the American Greatness website run by neoconservatives. Bill Bennett, Bolton, all these other people are there. Now, these are the representatives, American, any of these sort of American affairs, they're all neoconservative, although they also have a kind of West Coast Straussian influence, the followers of Harry Jaffa, who stress equality as a conservative value, pretty much equality as a conservative value. So all these people, are still running the show. Nothing has changed. I will believe a change has occurred when I see paleoconservatives on television, or people like paleo. When I see the alt-right represented somewhere, right. But you're not going to see this. They're going to have to get their own funding, and they'll have, as I say, they'll have to fight to take over the conservative movement. Meanwhile, the neoconservatives will remain in positions of power over the conservative movement.
Right. One of the things that I've noticed over the years, and you wrote an excellent essay on this, which we republished in Polish in War and Democracy, there's a very reoccurring theme in conservative, neoconservative, and in what has become known as the populist right in the States, currently with such champions as Steve Bannon, for example, who isn't a neocon per se, but in many ways repeats neocon talking points. and things that emanate from West Coast Straussian tradition. There's a term that reoccurs very often, which you criticized, and you pointed why it's a misstep to be used in the first place, and that term is Judeo-Christian. We hear a lot about Judeo-Christian values. It has become so popular that even our Polish president, after that tragic fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, wrote on his Twitter account that this is a sad day for Judeo-Christian civilization. And in the comments section, people were asking, what does Judeo have to do with Notre Dame Cathedral, with all due respect to our Jewish brothers and sisters, but where do you get the need to use this very Americanized term to talk about a distinctly Catholic building being burnt down? Professor, why shouldn't we use the term Judeo-Christian values or Judeo-Christian per se?
By the way, I have no objection to the word Judeo-Christian. I think Christianity is Judeo-Christian. I think if you look at the New Testament, there are obviously Jews. Many things Jesus and Paul teach are Jewish ideas. There is, a combined civilization. There's also a classical Judeo-Christian, right? You read Thomas Aquinas, he quotes Aristotle as his philosopher, and that civilization is synthetic. I have, no objection to this. I think there are common Judeo-Christian religious attitudes, values that are probably not shared with Muslims for the most part. Mm-hmm. So I do not object to it as an objective description of a synthetic civilization. What we both object to is the use of this by what you call the Jewish lobby, or the fear you're going to be attacked as an anti-Semite unless you say something like this.
Right.
And I think that to the extent it is done to kowtow to certain political interest, perhaps best represented by neoconservatives, I think the term might be it would be best to avoid the term, even though I think it is an accurate description of the synthetic nature of Western civilization and Western religiosity, but it is by now so identified with kowtowing to certain groups which don't share this, desire for outreach, that it might be best, to be avoided. In the United States, the word Judeo-Christian is very popular among Christian Zionists, which is not surprising. Evangelicals who are strongly Zionists are constantly talking about Judeo-Christian. I always tell them that, the 70% of Jewish liberals are not impressed by the usage and wish we'd stop using it.
It's not going to get you anywhere, right? Professor Gottfried, it was an excellent interview. Thank you very much for taking the time. And if we need to do any course correction or just to validate some of the statements, we'll give you a call. And you have a good afternoon, Professor, in the States.
Well, you are already living in the evening, aren't you? We're experiencing evening.
Yes. We're already after 2000 in military terms here, indeed.
Right.